Okay, this is a little macabre, but I can't help but ask the question. A steamboat leaves Bombay or leaves India, shows up to Jeddah, and 400 people have died on this steamboat. What do they do with those 400 bodies?
One of the sort of earliest, let's say, controversies around in the 1860s, let's say one person dies of cholera, and that person is deposited into the sea, right? Burial at sea. And then that fatality is not reported when you come to the next port, let's say Aden. So this was a perennial accusation on the part of the Ottomans that the British were purposefully not counting cholera deaths and allowing ships to get bills of health, essentially. And that was undermining their efforts to document the flow of cholera.
Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mike Yimhenna. Today on the series, we have Michael Christoper Low, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Utah. He's the director of the Middle East Center at the University of Utah, and he is the author of Imperial Mecca, Ottoman Arabia, and the Indian Ocean Hajj. Chris, welcome to Afikra.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, this conversation has been a long time coming. I've been really excited to chat with you ever since I came across your book. Because I'm fascinated by the history of Mecca, and I'm fascinated by how pilgrims actually get to Mecca, how they engage in the pilgrimage, the Hajj, and how that pilgrimage has changed over time, and the nature of that pilgrimage. So I'm showing my cards. That's why I was like super interested in getting to chat with you. But maybe before we even talk about this, maybe you can give us context about why you first became interested in this topic. Was it from the angle of sort of the technology story about steamships and steam, or did you come into it from Arabic, or how did you come into the story?
It's a great question, and I think it's a really important question for the shape of this book, and really sort of my intellectual formation. In some other interviews, I've sort of laid some emphasis. I think this is good for graduate students to hear, that in some respects, this project started from a place of weakness, of not knowing. And what I mean by that is, I was in Atlanta when the sort of idea for this kind of came into my head somewhere between 2005 and 2007 as a master's student. I had started studying Persian and then Arabic, and I was working with an Egypt specialist, Don Reed, at the time. And, really because I was at Georgia State, I wasn't yet at Columbia, where sort of all the resources that you could dream of, existed. I was at a little bit of a crossroads. I wasn't sure. I had an interest initially in British India, which I'm very thankful, events and training sort of pushed me towards the Arabian Peninsula. But that initial instinct kind of allowed me to sort of grow and work through Indian Ocean work, South Asian work, and colonial documents to give me a sense for something that I was sort of deeply engaged with. And so I was essentially doing kind of comparative work, between South Asia, Indian Ocean, and Middle East work. And then I studied Arabic in Yemen, and that was self-conscious too, right? To try and position myself kind of along the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean littoral. But, I just didn't have the language skills when I first started to really fully do the project that this ultimately became. And I think as a result of that, I kind of learned colonial historiography and, British archival materials first, added Arabic, and then realized that the project couldn't be executed, right? Saudi Arabia at the time was not really an option for this kind of research, and it wouldn't be appropriate for this topic and time period anyway. And then I eventually, when I got to Columbia, did Turkish and Ottoman Turkish. And so the project evolved sort of in three layers, right? An Indian Ocean, an Arab or Arabic-centric layer, and then a Turkish and Ottoman Turkish centric component. And I think as a result of that, I was able to sort of feel out all of those different parts of our field in different ways and sort of learn them in stages and then eventually put them together. And I think, I've said before, I'm not the best Ottomanist, I'm not the best Arabist, I'm not the best Indian Ocean specialist, but I can bring all of those tools to bear and I think create something interesting as a result of that mix.
Yeah. So if you were to try to explain what this book is about or what this book became about upon completion versus what you thought it was going to be about when you started, what's the difference?
Yeah. So I think when I started, the initial things that were interesting were colonial anxieties about cholera. And so in 2008, I published an article in the International Journal of Middle East Studies that really was about these sanitation and security questions. Back in the 80s, William Roth, who's really a sort of Southeast Asia specialist, had done an article that had similar interests, but a little bit less focused on Middle Eastern contexts. And that sort of clued me into some of these questions. And I started working in the British archives, again, going to Yemen, kind of getting out on the ground, visiting Kamaran Island, which was the quarantine island.
Can you, Chris, can you give some background about this? So this phrase that you just said, colonial fear of cholera, right? Colonial sort of nervousness and anxiety about a pandemic like cholera. When did this happen? Was it widespread? Why were they even fearful of cholera?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, so the penetration of the British into the Indian Ocean, the advent of various forms of steam travel, both steamship travel across oceans, but then also railways, it essentially allowed somewhere from the 1830s onward what had been previously an endemic disease pool. Cholera was endemic to the Ganges Delta in South Asia and would flare up and burn out without expanding to a pandemic and crossing oceans. But with the sort of acceleration of steam technology, if previously, if you got on a sailing vessel with cholera, you would die before you reached the other side of the Indian Ocean, right? But with a steamship, then you could have seemingly healthy people make their way to Jeddah or Mecca and then fall ill, and then, of course, come into intercourse, into contact with, other Muslims from other regions. And then, of course, you had an explosion of this connectivity where, in 1865, 66, you have this first really huge sort of globally understood outbreak where, you get a big outbreak in Cairo, and then it spreads to all the ports of the Mediterranean, and then it spreads to Paris and other major cities in Europe, and then across the Atlantic to New York and other American cities, right? So obviously, cholera was the 19th century disease, and so it was fearsome in its own right, taking tens of thousands of people per outbreak at times. But then this was also mixed with sort of political concerns, and I think that's the part that makes the topic so interesting, is that the British really couldn't separate in their mind their Islamophobia, their fear of anti-colonial movements being fostered in Mecca, which was slightly beyond their purview, right, under Ottoman control, and then sort of added in a little bit later under Abdulhamid II, of course, pan-Islamic sensibilities. And so they tended to sort of mix colonial subversion and the risk of cholera. In their minds, these things were really difficult to pull apart. And one of the things that I tried to do in this project is to really sort of think through what were the dynamics. In the previous literature, it always seemed like colonial regimes, whether we're talking about Britain, the Dutch in Southeast Asia, or France in North Africa, or Russia in Central Asia, that the colonial regimes were the sort of drivers of action with regard to cholera. And one of the things that I found was that the regime that should have been the most fearful, right, was the Ottomans. And in fact, the colonial fears of pan-Islam or anti-colonial subversion actually became more muted over time. And the Ottomans, actually the sort of the Muslim state at the heart of this, had much, much more to lose. They were having to manage these huge outbreaks of disease, but then also the threat of multiple colonial regimes trying to reach into the Hejaz and the holy cities. And so I tried to kind of, again, take this literature and instead of thinking of it through the sort of colonial administrator's lens, to think through it from the perspective of Istanbul and the colonial, or rather the Ottoman governors and administrators on the ground, and how they were having to deal with both the sort of material crisis of cholera, but then also the intervention of these colonial states simultaneously.
Okay, so can you give us a sense of how big of a problem this was? Like just speaking about cholera, what was the population in Mecca at the time? How many pilgrims were coming in and out of Mecca throughout the year, and where were they coming from? And like, give us a sense of the scale.
Sure. Let's say turn of the 20th century, we might have a total population, including all of the urban areas of the Hejaz, of maybe 400,000 people. So pretty small populations.
That's going
Mecca.
All the way up to like modern day Amman.
So I mean, if we're adding together, principal or urban agglomerations, Jeddah, Taif, Mecca, Medina, etc. Maybe we've got something in the the area of 400,000 people altogether. So that's just to give you kind of a little scale of the total local population that we're dealing with. If we're thinking about Jeddah, we're talking about a number sub 50,000 at the turn of the 20th century, right? I mean, what is Jeddah today? 4 million. So really, you kind of have to think this is a totally different landscape. Let's say prior to the 1850s, prior to the advent of regular steamship travel, the numbers is very difficult to get a sense of total population of pilgrimage attendees, but let's take a number like 50,000 as a sort of total number per year. Once we get into the sort of the 1880s, the 1890s, we're getting numbers that are especially in Hajj Akbar seasons, maybe 100,000, 200,000. By the time we get to World War I, those biggest years, most trafficked years, maybe cresting over 300,000, right? So, Hajj is growing between 1850 and World War I, maybe sixfold, right? So, and you can imagine too that the cities, whether we're talking about Jeddah or Mecca, the infrastructure and water capacity, provisioning of food, this is not growing by sixfold, right? So you may have a sort of seasonal influx because of steamships that's putting tremendous strain on what had previously been kind of a seasonal state, right? The Hejaz, of course, was ruled by the Sharifs in terms of day-to-day affairs. Increasingly after the 1880s, the power of the Ottoman state and the Ottoman governor was much larger. But, you were going from an autonomous state to increasingly the need to have a day-to-day, year-round state to deal with these kinds of issues. So it's putting tremendous strain both on the sort of constitutional arrangement of what the Hejaz was supposed to be, right? But then also the expectations of pilgrims themselves coming from colonial states, and then the colonial states themselves thinking, okay, we're modern. Singapore, Calcutta, Bombay have, X number of infrastructures. The Ottoman state lacks these things. So the Ottoman state was under tremendous pressure to sort of add these sort of modern amenities to keep up with this new influx of pilgrims, right? So really small local population, then sort of being overwhelmed and drowned by this new steamship influx. And then added on top of that, let's say from the 1860s onward, regular outbreaks of cholera that could take away, in the worst years, especially 1865, 66, and 1893, we're talking outbreaks that killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 50,000 pilgrims. So let's assume, a big year, let's say it's 200,000 pilgrims and 50,000 people die
Oh
in
my
that
God.
pilgrimage season. It's totally catastrophic. And then, of course, this is a global pandemic that is stretching, let's say, from the 1830s through the 1950s. This is, a problem that is no longer an issue that could be simply thought of as a problem of the Muslim world. It was a global problem, which essentially put Mecca on the map for colonial and international intervention.
And what was that intervention?
So from the 1860s in particular, in 1866 there was an international sanitary conference held in Istanbul, and this really was the first time that Mecca became a kind of ground zero for thinking about the transmission of cholera. Now, of course, from the 1880s, 1890s, and certainly the 20th century, we know that the origin point of cholera was India. Of course, at the time, they had some inkling that India was the sort of the cradle of this. But until the 1880s and 1890s, bacteriology and germ theory, those mechanisms, until 1884 and Robert Koch's discovery of the Kama bacillus, the sort of causal agent of cholera, it wasn't easily pinned down. So there was a sort of argument, and the British essentially were anti-contagionists. They wanted to sort of say that the causes of cholera were local, and they tended to say that Mecca was the sort of epicenter. They wanted to deflect attention away from India because, of course, they were afraid that other states would impose quarantines, embargoes, and damage the business, the sort of capitalist flows between India and Europe and ultimately England.
Was that on the table? I mean, who would have possibly instilled those embargoes? Because,
Sure, yeah.
I mean, I would imagine Egypt is also on the table, and Egypt is also this huge population that's exporting this type of stuff too. So,
Sure.
who would have instilled those embargoes? Is it just basically France?
Well, France and the collectivity of other European states.
Yeah.
I think that was the real threat. And so Britain became, and this is sort of a large part of the book, this obstreperous, very obstructionist force. I mean, sometimes when I give talks, I talk about climate change, right? Climate denial, right? You think about the United States as being very reluctant to sort of see its economic power dampened by measures to control climate change. Think of this kind of question with cholera, and Britain sees this as a very direct threat to the sort of safety of free trade in India and the Indian Ocean. Now, the Ottomans see this in a different light. There is some enthusiasm for quarantine as a way to underscore Ottoman sovereignty along its borders. And you can imagine, having passport controls and customs houses and quarantine officials. This is a way for the Ottoman state to say, hey, this is our territory, European states, stay away. But they also had a sort of an interest to protect the Hajj, but also to protect their own subjects, right? So they would complain really bitterly from the 1880s and 90s onward that, because of this sort of laissez-faire attitude of the British knew that people were going to Mecca and dying, and they refused to sort of, put up any meaningful controls. And they said, look, this is a matter of religious freedom. And so then the Ottomans are over a barrel. Right? On the one hand, they want to protect themselves, and then on the other hand, you couldn't be the sort of the caliph of Islam and discourage people from coming on Hajj. And so it became this catch-22 for them, where they, their instinct, right, was to know that this was going to be a dangerous affair, right? But to put up meaningful controls would be potentially to damage the religious sentiments of their Indian Ocean counterparts.
I want to talk about the quarantine process a little bit. You'd mentioned an island off of Yemen. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this first was proposed to have a sort of network of quarantine stations, and this included the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, Suez Canal, Red Sea, all the way down to essentially the mouth of the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandeb. And so there was some debate in the 1860s after the International Sanitary Conference in Istanbul about where to place these stations. And ultimately, Kamaran Island, which is a little bit north of Hodeidah, think somewhere halfway between Hodeidah and maybe today's Saudi border, off the coast of a tiny little place called Salif. And Kamaran, think of it as it's a tiny desert rock. Fishing villages, essentially. It's easy to control people's access to the coast. So it's unlikely that you're going to sort of have interactions in this remote location between a large local population. And so you're trying to sort of catch Indian Ocean pilgrims from Java, from Singapore, from Calcutta, from Karachi, from Bombay. You're trying to catch them before they reach Jeddah. And so they're stopped at Kamaran and forced to do, depending on the threat level and the reporting about the possibility of cholera, could be 5, 10, 15. But then there were examples of pilgrims being held beyond 40 days, missing Hajj altogether.
But who's running this island? Which state entity is running it?
So this is the interesting part here, is that there was a sort of collective agreement on the part of all of these international actors that they wanted a quarantine system. Of course, Britain didn't want that. But then the Ottomans essentially didn't want to sort of have European states running these quarantines on their territory.
Is it that the British didn't want it, or they didn't want to say they wanted it?
Maybe a little bit of both. Now, this changes over time,
Okay.
right? Eventually, by the 1896-97, you have plague outbreaks in India, and they give up at that point. But for about 30 years, between 1866 and 1896, they are generally opposed to stringent quarantines. So the Ottomans sort of step into the breach. And one of the things that, so bothers the Ottomans is that they feel that this problem is manufactured in India and imported to them, and then they have to pick up the bill for this. And then also, because of the sort of capitulations and the sort of the weakness of the Ottoman state, then you have European members on the International Sanitary Board. And so decision-making is not the Ottomans to make alone, but they're having to run the day-to-day operations of this quarantine island to construct the facilities. Now, when this island ultimately opens, you have the sort of decision that we should do this in 1866, but it's not opened until 1882. And then the original facilities, think thatched huts, think, non-brick and mortar buildings, extraordinarily hot, humid temperatures in the southern Red Sea, and inadequately staffed. So there are all kinds of complaints about sort of the conduct of this. Now, it improves gradually, and by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, we start to see the interventions at Kamaran starting to really make some progress in controlling the flow of cholera. But it really takes 3 to 4 decades to stand this system up. And then in the interim, right, the British say, look, this is poorly done. Our pilgrims are being mistreated. The local fishermen who are being hired to be the guards are beating people who just want water or more food provisions. There's a lot of mutual misunderstanding. Many of the physicians who are sent from Istanbul, maybe Christian physicians who don't have the proper sensitivity to Muslim pilgrims. And so there are all of these sort of cross jurisdiction, cross-border, cross-cultural misunderstandings that happen on Kamaran. And as a result, of course, you have many outbreaks of cholera that not only happen on Kamaran, but are not contained. And one of the arguments that the British make is that ultimately this is useless, that pilgrims are suffering, having to take longer, having to pay more in order to stay at this quarantine island, and then you're still having the outbreaks reach Jeddah and Mecca. But of course, this is a learning curve for the whole globe, how to deal with this scourge. We might think about in a sort of more condensed time frame what we dealt with COVID. It took us months and years to figure out exactly what we should be doing, and in the interim, there's a lot of suffering. But imagine that process spread over a period of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 decades to really sort of master these processes. And that's what makes Kamaran, I think, so interesting.
I'm curious about the spread into the Ottoman Empire, the rest of the Ottoman Empire. So if it's coming from India, it's, entering into the Arabian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula through Jeddah, essentially, and presumably through Egypt.
Yes.
But this is before the Hejaz Railway. How does it spread into Istanbul?
So this is, I think, a question that deserves more attention. So I was working on a project called Appraising Risk with McGill University. They had a sort of multi-university partnership. And one of my colleagues at University of Minnesota, Zozan Patlevan, who's a specialist of environmental history in Kurdistan, one of the questions that we had and started to compile some data on this was, how does cholera spread by sea versus over land? And I think we have a bit of a dearth of good answers for how cholera is moving, for example, in Iraq, right? If cholera reaches Basra, certainly it can move by river, by steamboat, but it's also moving among tribesmen over land, and we see the spread into sort of more northern Iraqi cities, Mosul, into Syria, into other parts of Armenia and Kurdistan. But the numbers in this sort of a dramatic, let's say, traceability of that spread is not the same as along the sort of coastal littoral. So one of the things that I think is deceiving, yes, cholera spreads over land, but we're able to sort of document the numbers with steamships, right? If 900 people get on a steamship in Bombay and then they make it to Aden and you have a cholera outbreak, you can document 10 people died. And then the ship was sent on to Kamaran, 100 people died. And then the ship was sent on to Jeddah, 400 people died. And then it goes on to Suez. And then, 2 weeks later, you have an outbreak flare up in Cairo. This sort of tracking mechanism, the modern sort of systems of visas and passports that start to grow up, especially after the 1880s, and these essentially documentary practices allow us to count and really understand sort of where cholera is spreading. So we know a lot more about the seaborne routes as opposed to the overland routes. But to your question about how does it reach Istanbul, essentially returning pilgrims is the most reliable pathway that we know of. Yes.
Okay, this is a little macabre, but I can't help but ask the question. A steamboat leaves, Bombay, or leaves India, shows up to Jeddah, and 400 people have died on this steamboat. What do they do with those 400 bodies?
So this is a real question, and one of the sort of earliest, let's say, controversies around in the 1860s was that you had individuals. Let's say it's not so dramatic, right? That you're not having mass deaths, but let's say one person dies of cholera, and that person is deposited into the sea, right? Burial at sea. And then that fatality is not reported when you come to the next port, let's say Aden. So this was a perennial accusation on the part of the Ottomans that the British were purposefully not counting cholera deaths and allowing ships to get bills of health, essentially. and that was undermining their efforts to document the flow of cholera. But certainly you have quite grisly stories, again, of bodies being deposited into the sea. Kamaran Island, certainly this was a common practice to deposit bodies into the ocean rather than trying to bury them in the quarantine facilities. But then you have these really macabre stories of, you can imagine, third-class passengers, steerage passengers, sort of the poor passengers, packed tightly into a steamship, into the hold, below decks, and then cholera breaks out. And you can imagine the sort of the gruesome scenes that would emerge. And so you do have kind of a comparison here to almost the environment of a kind of middle passage.
Yeah.
So I think it's lost on us in the 20th and 21st century sometimes, the degree of making Hajj as an act of bravery, an act of faith, in the face of this potential quite grisly ending for pilgrims.
Yeah. I have never thought of cholera. I'm going to just out myself. I've never thought of cholera as being part of the story of Mecca. As this, the way you're describing it seems like this very sort of defining moment in the history, in the sort of modern or contemporary history of the story of this place.
I would say it's the most important, sort of most singular influence on Mecca and the Hejaz from 1850 at least until 1950, 1957, right? So, I mean, this is even Saudi Arabia. I mean, we think of Saudi Arabia as not being implicated in, let's say, colonial. It wasn't colonized. That's so the story goes, right? But of course, the external steamship relations, the management of the Hajj until people reach Saudi soil was managed by international colonial first, Ottoman, then Colonial, then League of Nations, then World Health Organization, until 1957, right? And so we can think of this as a real threat, not only to Ottoman sovereignty, but to Saudi sovereignty well up into the middle of the 20th century. And so I think it's worth us thinking, and I think that this is that the Saudi state understands that epidemic disease is a real threat to their sovereignty, and legitimacy, and that extends even to the present. And so the amount of resources that are put into managing the sort of health and security of the Hajj, even today, really harken back to that crisis of cholera. So we can kind of think about the dramatic actions that were taken to really prevent a mass Hajj in 2020, 2021 as being a kind of epilogue to that cholera story of the 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder to what extent, let's take Sharif, okay? To what extent was the story of cholera, the tragedy of cholera, to what extent was that part of their own story of I mean, they had national aspirations for sure, but and there wasn't sort of a national identity, but to what extent was it almost like the potato famine or like the collapse of the silk industry in Lebanon that resulted in its own famine? To what extent was it this is something that we had to bear and we pushed through it and we persevered and this helps tell the story of who we are?
So I just want to clarify, you mentioned the Sharifs. We're talking about the Hashemites here in particular.
Yeah.
I mean, one way to look at the Hashemites, of course, their relationship with the British sours, of course, for reasons related to Palestine on some level. But if you dig into the sort of the interregnum, between the Arab Revolt in 1916 and then eventually the Saudi takeover in 24, 25, 26. That 10-year period, one of the frustrations that the British had was the ineptitude and the lack of seriousness in dealing with these questions of quarantine and epidemic disease. on the part of the Hashemites. And of course, when the Saudis come in, I mean, they really talk about the sort of bad old days of the Hashemites in terms of the ineptitude of running the Hajj, of personal security, personal safety. Now, this could get us into questions of Bedouin raiding and things like that. But cholera was sort of the number one issue that had to be constantly addressed. So this really it delegitimizes constantly the Hashemites' sort of claims to legitimacy across the Islamic world. I mean, this kind of claim against them, their venality, their fleecing of pilgrims, and in the book I talk quite a bit at length about various schemes to sort of extract money from the pilgrims. The British, the Ottomans, individual pilgrims all really pointed the finger at the Hashemites as being, quite bad at this, as opposed to the Saudi regime that comes after. And the Saudis are very serious about kind of cleaning up the abuses of pilgrims, whether we're talking about the Bedouins or we're talking about the Mutawafin, the pilgrimage guides, or sanitary and security measures with regard to cholera.
You describe Mecca as being this like trans-imperial space, right? Mecca and Hejaz, a trans-imperial space.
Yeah.
Why does it qualify for that term?
So this is a claim that I think the broader literature needs to accommodate more fully. So one of the things that I kind of found the further that I got into this project was that if we're talking about especially Hejaz and Yemen, the Red Sea more generally, on paper we think, okay, this is Ottoman territory, this is part of the Middle East, and fair enough, this is technically an Ottoman ostensibly sovereign space, but of course it's an autonomous space. The sovereignty is shared with the Sharifs of Mecca. And then the most powerful regime, the most powerful foreign power in the region is, of course, the British in India and elsewhere. And if we tried to sort of map out a zone of influence, the Hejaz and Yemen are the farthest, most extreme logistical challenge for the Ottomans, right? It's the nth degree of their influence. And both of those territories are, quite shaky, quite autonomous. They're unable to enact all of their state building plans, right? So if we think about the reforms of the 19th century, the Tanzimat, those sort of signature programs of the Ottomans, the Hejaz is not completely insulated from those reforms, but very lightly so. I mean, there's some constitutional reasons related to Islam itself for not imposing some of those westernizing reforms, but it's difficult for the Ottomans to sort of enact all of their modernizing project. They did try, for sure.
But before we get to their attempts,
yeah,
what is the point that is closest in geographically where they were successful? Like, if you were to walk away from Mecca in any direction,
mm-hmm.
where would you stop being in a trans-imperial space?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question is, let me start with a comparison of sort of the relative degree to which the Ottomans could sort of claim that they could impose their modernizing will, right? So think about the degree of the state's reach into Syria, or certainly Anatolia, right? The state was able to sort of, impose its will in a fuller kind of way, right? Hejaz Railway is a great sort of a barometer,
litmus
of this,
test.
right? It's a litmus test, yeah. So you could think, in order to be a fully functional sovereign state, we're going to have border controls, passports, quarantines, a telegraph system, and a railway that will connect this faraway place. Ultimately, they were able to build this railway as far as Medina with great difficulty, lots of resistance, and ultimately were not able to extend that all the way to Mecca. And I think that's a great dividing line, is that that modernizing state project traveled as far as Medina and then hit a wall. And so we can kind of think of this as a kind of incomplete project. Now, let's take this from the other kind of end of the spectrum. If we think about the Red Sea off the coast of Jeddah, what is the most powerful naval force trolling those waters? Is it the Ottoman Empire? Definitely not, right? It's most definitely the British Empire. If we think about population, if we're thinking about Jeddah or Mecca, who are the most powerful bankers in those places? Indians. Who are the most powerful merchant houses? Indians. Population of Mecca, perhaps a quarter of Mecca is Indian. And if we added in other groups who are also British subjects, and this was a real concern for the Ottomans, right? If you added together Jawis, Southeast Asians under Dutch control, plus British South Asia, plus other colonial constituencies, it's conceivable that you would have 25, 35, 45, 50% of the population of Mecca carrying someone else's passport and being on some level beholden to some other state power, right? So is Mecca more influenced by Istanbul or some other constituency in the Indian Ocean? I think that's a sort of question that's up for grabs. Another question that we can ask is Mecca's identity an Indian Ocean, a more cosmopolitan mixed identity, or is it an Arab or an Ottoman identity? And I certainly think that we could make an argument that the Ottomans were as much foreigners in Mecca as some British subject hailing from India, right? So, I'm trying to sort of make the argument that in order to understand the Arabian Peninsula or a place like Jeddah or Mecca, certainly we could say the same thing about maybe the Persian Gulf or Yemen. It's not legible only through Middle Eastern studies. You need the British Empire and the Indian Ocean to really fully understand the totality of the environment.
Yeah. I kind of want to just open it up in two other directions that we're not looking at, just to kind of complete the compass. To what extent were people coming from the Caucasus and Central Asia present, and how did they get there? And then to what extent were people who were coming from Africa there, and were they British subjects as well, or were they subjects of other places? So let's try to complete the map a little bit.
So one thing that I want to make a plug for other people's work
please.
Here. So there's been fantastic work done in different directions. So if we want to think about the British Empire, John Slight's book is excellent. Russian Empire, Eileen Kane. My colleague Lale John, of course, has also written a book about the Ottoman Hajj from Central Asia, spiritual subjects. I would say that's sort of the book to think about that sort of northern-facing set of geographies. And then, of course, we've got a variety of books and articles that look at North and West Africa as well. I think the one thing that I would say that differentiates the Indian Ocean is the sort of two largest constituencies, the largest annual groups that would probably account for somewhere between 40 and 50% of Hajj pilgrims. Is going to be, let's say, 20 to 25% each, somewhere in that neighborhood, will be Jawis, Southeast Asians, and then South Asians. So if we want to think about the Indian Ocean as being on the bottom end, maybe a little less than 40%, on the top end, something like 50%, that's where the sort of real political heat exists, right?
Yeah.
And part of that born because of cholera. Now, these other pilgrimage populations, right? You mentioned the Caucasus and Central Asia. It's hard to disentangle on some level these populations because they're conditioned by the pathways, right? They're conditioned by how they travel. And so Central Asians and Caucasus populations are coming through the Black Sea, and then ultimately through the Suez Canal from the north. So they're having slightly different experiences with quarantine, with cholera risk, with the places that they're passing through. I would just, again, make a little bit of a plug for Lalejan's work. I think one of the interesting things about the northerly route is the itineraries that people take, right?
Yeah.
So oftentimes pilgrims are stopping in Istanbul and other places. They're visiting Jerusalem en route or as part of their itinerary, either coming or going. They may be taking side trips to other Middle Eastern cities. And so Hajj takes on this secular sightseeing and adventure component, learning the modern world, interacting with the caliphate, interacting with the sort of most powerful Muslim regime. And so, for a Central Asian pilgrim, they might be staying at a Sufi lodge in Istanbul and connecting with different kinds of people from other parts of their region or from the Middle East. So slightly different dynamics and aesthetics involved in those journeys. But the thing that I would say about the difference between these two places is not having cholera as sort of the front and center issue for all of these pilgrims, but then the sort of demographic weight. So let's imagine that in a given year you have, let's say 25,000, and again, I'm just pulling a number, 25,000 Indian pilgrims. You might have 1,000, 2,000, 2,500 Central Asian pilgrims, right? So in terms of the sort of state management, these are, orders of magnitude different.
Yeah. When you think about pilgrims, right? The term pilgrims, there's obviously the definition that we're using in this case, people on a pilgrimage. In the North American context, it's people who are doing really a one-way ticket, and are kind of like interested in almost, colonizing and eradicating and all these different things. I'm curious, all these people coming from South Asia who are going to Hajj, how many of them are staying? How many of them are saying, I'm Jeddawi going forward? Yeah. This is, my kids are going to be Jeddawi. This is who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is an interesting angle in not only in my book, but again in Lalejan's work as well. This question of who is a mujawir or mujawir, and what that means in a sort of pre-industrial, pre-colonial setting, right? So, ideally Mecca should be a refuge, right? It should be a place that is, welcome to all Muslims. Now, colonial dynamics change this, right? So by the time we get into the 1860s, 1880s, Ottoman citizenship, Ottoman nationality laws are changing and tightening. And in part, they're tightening to try and differentiate from these colonial regimes. Even things like laws about owning real estate. Theoretically, Muslims should be able to own real estate in Mecca. All Muslims, that shouldn't be an issue. But in the 1880s, the Ottomans started to put restrictions on owning real estate for non-Ottoman Muslims. Now, think about how dramatic this potentially is. There were even petitions that were written to the Ottoman state that said, you can't do this, right? This is not Islamically correct. We understand the concerns about the Dutch and the British and their influence via their subjects, their passport holders. But to do this is a step too far. It damages the religious sensibilities and the relationship of these populations to the caliph. But there was this fine line, right? The Ottomans actually became scared of other Muslims who happened to be living under colonial rule. Now, numbers, that's a difficult thing to answer. Who was holding a passport other than an Ottoman one? And there's a lot of thought about the naturalization process and the need to make these people proper Ottoman subjects. But actual numbers in terms of who is registered with a given consulate at any given time, that was a really contentious matter. So, for example, you mentioned someone who takes Hajj, let's pretend they, go in 1840. And 2 generations later, their identity, they're still Indian, right? They may be speaking Indian languages. The population understands them locally as that identity. And then maybe 2 generations on, they run into trouble with the Ottoman state, and then they go to the British consulate and say, I want a British passport. So you can imagine all of the tensions, and there are these really dramatic cases that happen over, in chapter 2 of my book, there's a woman whose family is connected to Calcutta, and the husband passes away, and then the Ottoman state, the Ottoman governor, and some cronies put pressure on her to essentially give the power of attorney to someone that was friendly to Ottoman interests, right? So we're having, husband dies, and then 10, 20 years later, we're having a dispute about whose citizenship is attached to this property or this business holding, right? And so this was a brand new thing. Previously, Mecca, you didn't have to have a passport. If you were moved to, travel and immigrate to Mecca, that was a normal and indeed a pious thing to do, to become a mujawirin. But then the context shifts, right, with modern documentary practices, international legal constraints. And, we think of today as a pilgrim going to Saudi Arabia, you can't just up and go to Mecca. You have to apply for the proper visa, right? And you can't stay, if you want to, just because of religious sentiment. So the modern world has really shifted the possibilities of Mecca as a place of refuge for Muslims.
Yeah. But at the time, do we have we've talked about this insane population growth, right? So at some point you said, you gave me a number, I think at the beginning, in the middle of the 1800s. By the time you get to 1957, where you describe this sort of being the end of this Trans-Imperial phase, how much has the population ballooned, and is it because of birth rates, or is it because of just importing people, essentially?
Yeah. I don't have a number for Jeddah off the top of my head for 1957, but certainly we can look at the sort of middle decades, right, between, obviously the discovery of commercial amounts of oil.
Yeah.
To the present, right? If we're thinking about Jeddah as a sort of, pre-20th century or pre-1950 place, we're talking tens of thousands of people, and then ballooning to a few 100,000 people in the middle of the 20th century. Now, in the beginning of the 21st century, 3.5, 4 million people. Certainly oil and the prosperity of oil wealth is a component of that, and the ability. I make the argument in my new book project that really a place like Jeddah is not possible without the advent of man-made fossil-fueled water, desalination technology, right? So the first desalination plant comes in right before World War I, British manufactured, made in Scotland, but made possible by the Ottomans. I make the argument that transition to really sort of escaping the normal ecological boundaries of the water resources of the Arabian Peninsula, that's the thing that really makes population growth possible. Now, to be sure, not unlike other parts of the Arabian Peninsula, yes, imported labor is coming in all of the oil states. We know that, that's part of the picture. But that alone doesn't account for the ability to move beyond those previous ecological constraints, right?
Yeah.
Where you're really sort of dependent on the capacity of a series of, Ain Zubaydah, for example, a very old aqueduct system, and, a shaky system of wells. But once you implant this new technology for turning salt water into fresh water, then those ecological constraints are dramatically altered and lifted over the course of the 20th century.
What do they do with all that salt?
So unfortunately, reject brine is dumped back into the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, or wherever you are across the world. There are some really interesting things that are happening, conversations about what to do with reject brine.
This is like the saltiest water of all time.
Well, this is actually a really kind of a difficult question in the Persian Gulf, where salinity always was high. Persian Gulf is a very shallow sea
Yeah.
and has a very narrow outlet. And then, of course, your feeding rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, are being dammed as well. So you're not replenishing with enough fresh water. And so that salinity is increasing with the constant use of desalination systems. There is a scholar, I believe his name is Kemal Çelik, a Turkish scholar at NYU Abu Dhabi, who's done some interesting work about taking reject brine as a building material and making it into to bricks. So perhaps in the future, we're going to be able to solve that problem, but this is one of the signature features of the kind of ecological damage of doing large-scale desalination.
Yeah. I'm curious about the idea of like what we were talking a little bit about, like what people think they are in these places, in these sort of like liminal spaces. So this like Indian woman from Calcutta in 1840 may think, I'm Indian, I live here, but I'm actually an Indian person, right? And I have a British passport. I'm curious and this is maybe an unanswerable question, but I'm curious what you think. What other subjects of these empires actually think about Mecca from afar? So like, did people in Anatolia think, oh yeah, Mecca is totally Ottoman? Did people in India and Egypt and other parts of and actually in London think, yeah, Mecca is totally this is totally us? I mean, was it also in this sort of this like liminal trans-imperial space as you describe it?
Yeah, I want to be clear here that there's no there's no stable claim of sovereignty for the British, right? This is always a bit of a fantasy or a conspiracy, right, to bring the caliphate under British control, right? That idea, let's say from the 1870s onward, various writers, fantasize about this, and then it climaxes and becomes official state policy during World War I, right?
With like sort of Lawrence and
yeah. So I mean, there's the fantasy on the one hand, and then the sort of more technical realities of all of these individuals, pilgrims or local subjects carrying British or other colonial passports, right? That makes this a really difficult space for the Ottomans. The other component about it being a weird trans-imperial space is that it's the three layers. There's Ottoman, there's colonial influence, and then there's the autonomy of the Sharif of Mecca, right? Which allows for this influence to maneuver in ways that, if there was no Sharif of Mecca and you have full sovereignty for the Ottomans, perhaps they could have pushed back against colonial influence in ways that they were not able. But they were not a united front in any way, shape, or form.
Was that autonomy granted? Was it just defended? Is it like why was there that autonomy?
So that autonomy was traditional, going all the way back to the Ottoman conquest of the Arab world by Selim the Grim in 1517. This is partly the Ottomans had many autonomous provinces, right? We think of Egypt, for example, the Khedivate. There's a sort of early modern wisdom in ruling through local elites and princes, right? You collect revenues, you collect taxes, you're able to sort of, have the footprint of the state, and yet you don't have to commit all of these resources to constantly occupy. And Hejaz was unique, right, for its sort of sanctity on the one hand, and of course you can't collect taxes, right? So being the Khadam al-Haramain al-Sharifain, right, being the sort of, protector of the two holy places, is an honor and essentially the sort of, what I argue is the sort of foundation stone of a weak Ottoman claim to the caliphate, right? To be caliph, ideally, you should, be of Qurayshi descent. You should be Arab. But that Ottoman claim, not unlike Mamluk claims, or even before that, Salahuddin Ayyubi, these are Kurdish and Turkish states who are making this claim. And so this is an honorific. This gives them geopolitical power in the Muslim world, right? But to sort of rule in Mecca in a pre-modern or early modern context takes a lot of resources, and you would have to fight essentially the sort of local administration there. And so it was a practical matter to allow a certain level of prestige and autonomy to the sharifs. Now, that changes in the late 19th century because of the sort of the requirements of sovereignty and to be a modern state. Having an autonomous ruler underneath you was seen as sort of a weakness. And the Europeans keyed in on this from the 70s and 80s onward, and they kept questioning, are you really sovereign in Mecca? Well, what does international law have to say about this? If a crime is committed in Mecca, who's going to adjudicate that? And the Ottomans had to do this kind of funny dance and say, yes, we're sovereign, but also the Sharif of Mecca has autonomy, and Mecca is under Sharia law, but you have Ottoman courts in Jeddah. And so for the British, they see this, look, this is a potential opening, a potential weakness. And so I think that that's the sort of dynamism in the book, is how the Ottomans navigate these multiple overlapping traditional layers of how this place should be run, but then trying to sort of meet the new standards of what being a sovereign should look like.
The British, they're sort of maneuvering with the trucial states in the sort of the Persian and Arabian Gulf. That strategy there, was there, in your research, did you find anything that there was a similar strategy on the Red Sea? That like, okay, we're going to actually establish these autonomous states as well, and there's a way to sort of strip them out?
So this is not always explicitly stated, but British thinking about the Sharif of Mecca ruling through a local prince, right, was a very natural kind of thing for the British, right? We think about indirect rule, empire on the cheap. So you think of the British Raj. I think most lay people tend to think of that as an India phenomenon. But of course, we know that all of the sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf were part of the British Raj as well. They were considered part of the security frontier. And so you kept those rulers in place, but you had a British resident or a British consular official. And the same kind of idea was floating around the British Empire. And certainly the Ottomans were aware that autonomy was a sort of cracked door to British influence, right? So whether we're talking about the Sharif of Mecca or we're talking about the Khedive in Egypt, right? Think about what happened in the context of the Khedivate. Eventually, that autonomy allows a European power to come in and occupy. And so the Ottomans were well aware of that. I think the other thing for us to kind of put into the mix here is British princely states. Even within South Asia, parts of the Indian subcontinent were managed and ruled using various Indian princes. And so to imagine the Sharif of Mecca as part of this network is not a great stretch of the imagination. And so to think of at the end of World War I, potentially that Sharif Hussein would take his a prized place as a caliph alongside these other princes as part of the British Empire, it doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. Chris, thanks so much for joining. This has been super, super interesting. For those listening, the book is Imperial Mecca, Ottoman Arabia, and the Indian Ocean Hajj. Came out on Columbia University Press. You can find Chris online pretty easily. Chris, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me.